Tonight, you are tired. Not the kind of tired that a good night of sleep will fix. Something deeper than that. Something that has been accumulating not just across today, but across many days. The slow weight of a life lived at a pace that does not leave room for the question underneath all the other questions. The question is not complicated. It sounds almost too simple when you say it plainly. Is any of this held by something larger than me? Tonight, we are going to read a book together. It is an ancient book, written 2,000 years ago, by people who were asking a version of that same question under conditions far more urgent than yours. It is called the Book of Jubilees. It is layered and honest and carefully constructed. And it has been traveling through time, through desert caves and highland monasteries, and the hands of people who decided it was worth keeping to arrive in this quiet room on this particular night. You do not need to know anything coming in. You do not need a theology degree or a background in ancient history. You only need to be here, breathing, willing to listen. We will begin slowly, and we will go all the way through. Chapter 1. The Book at the Edge of the Shelf. There is a particular kind of book that most people never read. Not because it is difficult, exactly. Not because it is too long or too strange or too demanding, but because it sits just outside the circle of things that get recommended, things that get passed down from parent to child with the instruction that this one matters. It sits at the edge of the shelf, present, unclaimed, old enough that even the forgetting of it has been forgotten. The Book of Jubilees is that kind of book. If you grew up attending church, you almost certainly never heard it mentioned on a Sunday morning. If you studied scripture in any formal setting, it was not in your curriculum. If you have spent years reading the Bible carefully, you may have come across a footnote reference to it at the bottom of a page, a small italic notation that appeared and disappeared before you had time to ask what it was. That footnote does not tell you what it should. The Book of Jubilees is one of the most complete and carefully constructed texts to survive from the ancient Jewish world. It is not a fragment. It is not a collection of disconnected sayings or partially preserved wisdom. It is a full, sustained, deeply intentional work of theological writing that spans 50 chapters and covers the entire sweep of sacred history, from the creation of the world to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. It was composed with a specific purpose, by people living in a specific crisis, and it carries within it an argument that is still worth hearing 2,000 years after it was first made. Most readers who encounter it for the first time feel something unexpected. Not confusion, though there is complexity. Not distance, though it is old. Something closer to recognition. The feeling of finding someone else's journal and realizing they had been in the same room you have been in, just a very long time before you. That feeling is worth following. And tonight, we are going to follow it all the way through. Before we go further, it is worth knowing something about the world in which this book was born. Because context is not background noise for the Book of Jubilees, context is the key. The book was written sometime in the 2nd century before Christ. Scholars who have studied its language, its theology, and its relationship to other texts from the same period place its composition in the years surrounding one of the most acute crises in the history of the Jewish people. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV had implemented a systematic program of forced Hellenization across the territories he controlled. For most populations under Seleucid rule, this meant cultural pressure. For the Jewish community in Israel, it meant something closer to erasure. The Torah was prohibited. Sabbath observance was made a capital offense. The temple in Jerusalem was rededicated to Zeus. Circumcision, the bodily sign of the covenant between God and the descendants of Abraham, was outlawed. And the calendar, the sacred system of weeks and months and appointed times by which the Jewish community had organized its worship and its identity for centuries, was being replaced by the Greek calendar. The count was being overwritten. Understanding that pressure is not a footnote. It is everything. When you know what the people who wrote this book were living through, the book stops being an ancient curiosity and becomes something you recognize from the inside. It becomes the response of a community that was being told to forget who it was, and that refused. The formal title of the book in Hebrew is Sefer HaYovelim, the Book of the Jubilees. The word Yovelim is the plural of Yovel, the Hebrew word for Jubilee. And Jubilee, in the biblical tradition, is not simply a word for celebration. It is a specific and sacred institution. Every 49 years, after 7 cycles of 7 years, the 50th year was declared a year of Jubilee. Debts were cancelled. Slaves were freed. Land that had been sold was returned to its original families. The shofar, the ram's horn, was blown across the hills to announce that something was being reset, that what had been lost could be reclaimed, that the accumulated weight of time and its transactions was being lifted by the hand of God. The author takes this institution and applies it to all of history. Every event is placed within a precise Jubilee cycle, a precise week of years, a precise year within that week. History, in this book, is not a river flowing without direction. It is a calendar, a measured progression of appointed times, moving toward an appointed end, held in the hands of the one who established the count before the world began. For a community whose calendar was being taken from them, this was not abstract theology. It was survival. If you can still tell the story of where you are in the sacred count, you have not lost your place. And if you have lost your place in the sacred count, you have lost something harder to recover than land or language or even life itself. There is a woman named Clara. She is 38 years old and she lives outside of Nashville, Tennessee. She left the church she grew up in during her 20s, not in anger but slowly, the way people leave things when the reasons for staying gradually become less audible than the reasons for going. She did not stop believing. She stopped believing that the version she had been given was the whole story. She started reading on her own, following threads wherever they led. And one evening, about a year ago, she found a reference to the Book of Jubilees in an academic article. She followed the thread for 3 hours. She ordered 2 books. She stayed up until 2 in the morning, reading about a community that had lived and written and prayed and fought to maintain its identity 2,000 years ago. She told a friend the next day that reading about that community felt less like history and more like recognition, like finding evidence that someone had been in the same room she was in just a very long time ago. That is the experience the Book of Jubilees can offer when you come to it with patience and genuine attention. Now let us talk about what this book actually is, because understanding its form is as important as understanding its content. The Book of Jubilees presents itself as a dictation. An angel, referred to throughout the text as the angel of the presence, speaks to Moses during his 40 days and nights on Mount Sinai and recounts to him the full history of creation and the patriarchs. He fills in details that Genesis left unnamed. He establishes dates that Genesis does not give. He emphasizes laws and practices that the author believed needed to be more clearly understood by a community under pressure. This literary device, the idea of a heavenly mediator clarifying and expanding what was already given at Sinai, was a well-established convention in ancient Jewish literature. Scholars call the broader genre pseudepigrapha, from the Greek meaning writings under a different name. This is a description of a form, not a criticism of an intent. In the ancient world, writing in the name or voice of a revered figure was a recognized way of claiming that your teaching stood in continuity with the tradition that person represented. The author of Jubilees was saying, in the language their audience understood, what I am about to tell you is not my private opinion. It stands in the line of what was revealed at Sinai. This distinction matters. When modern readers discover that the Book of Jubilees was probably not written by Moses himself, the temptation is to dismiss it as a forgery. But that reaction applies contemporary standards of authorship to an ancient text in a way that serves neither the text nor the reader. The question worth asking is not who held the pen. The question is what the people who produced this book were trying to say, why they felt it needed to be said. and whether what they said has anything to offer to someone reading it in a quiet room 2,000 years later. On all three counts, the answer is more interesting than you might expect. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed the scholarly understanding of this book in a way that is difficult to overstate. Before their discovery, the complete text of Jubilees was known only through an Ethiopic translation, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which had included Jubilees in its biblical canon and copied it faithfully across 16 centuries. When the scrolls were discovered in the caves above Qumran, beginning in 1947, scholars found fragments of at least 15 separate manuscripts of Jubilees written in Hebrew, 15 copies in one community, more than some books that eventually entered the standard biblical canon. The community that hid its library in those desert caves did not treat Jubilees as marginal. They treated it as essential. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church deserves more than a passing mention here. It is one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, with roots reaching back to the 4th century. The Ethiopian Church developed its own rich tradition of biblical scholarship, its own liturgical language in Ge'ez, and its own canonical list of sacred texts. That list, which is larger than the canons used by most Western Christian traditions, includes the Book of Jubilees, not as a supplement or a curiosity. As scripture, this means that for Ethiopian Christians, Jubilees is not an ancient footnote. It has been read in churches and copied by monks and taught to children and woven into the fabric of faith for over 1,600 years. When people in the West encounter Jubilees as a strange and unfamiliar text, the strangeness is not in the book. It is in the distance that Western readers have traveled from the world that produced it. There is a student named Marcus. He is 22 years old, studying history at a university in Ohio, and his grandmother came from Addis Ababa. She attends an Ethiopian Orthodox church 2 towns from where he grew up. In his junior year, he took a course on ancient Jewish literature and encountered a lecture that mentioned Jubilees. Something clicked. He texted his grandmother that night and asked if she had ever heard of it. She called him back in 7 minutes and talked for 45. She told him the name in Ge'ez. She told him she had grown up hearing portions of it read during certain feast days. She told him her own grandmother had known passages of it by heart. He sat with the phone in his hand after they hung up, thinking about the distance between a footnote in an academic article and 45 minutes of his grandmother's voice. That distance is part of what this book carries. It survived, not because institutions protected it, but because people loved it enough to keep copying it when copying was slow and there was no guarantee that anyone in the future would care. The Ethiopian church kept it. The community at Qumran sealed it in clay jars in the desert. And when a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave in 1947 and heard the sound of breaking pottery, the world recovered what the desert had been holding in silence for nearly 2,000 years. The jars held. Tonight we are going to open them together. There is no rush. The night is long, and the book has been patient for 2,000 years. Settle in. Let everything else wait on the other side of the door. The book begins where all the great books begin. At the beginning. Chapter 2. A map before the journey. Before you walk into a forest, it helps to know something about its shape. Not every trail, not every tree. Just enough to understand that what you are entering has structure, that it was designed by someone who knew where they wanted you to arrive, and that the paths inside it are not random even when they feel that way. The Book of Jubilees is that kind of forest. It has a shape, and spending a few minutes with the architecture before we go deeper will make everything that follows more connected and more useful to carry with you when the night is over. The first thing to understand is the Jubilee system itself, because it is not just the title of the book, it is the skeleton of everything inside it. In the Hebrew tradition, the number 7 carries enormous weight. The 7th day is the Sabbath. The 7th year is the sabbatical year, when the land rests and debts are released. And after 7 cycles of 7 years, after 49 years, comes the Jubilee. The 50th year. the year of release and return, and the sounding of the ram's horn across the hills. The author maps this system onto all of human history. Every event is placed within a specific Jubilee period, a specific week of years within that period, a specific year within that week. Creation happens in the first week of the first Jubilee. The births and deaths of the patriarchs fall within precisely counted cycles. Noah's flood occupies a precisely numbered Jubilee. Abraham's call comes at a specific point in the count. This precision is not decorative. It is the argument, made not in a sermon but in the architecture of the text itself. History is not chaos. Time is not a river flowing without direction. Every moment has a position. Every event has a place in the sacred count. And the God who established the count at the beginning of creation is the same God present in every Jubilee, every week of years, every ordinary day that feels as though it might not matter. For a community watching its world come apart under political pressure, this was not a comforting abstraction. It was a lifeline. You are not lost. You are exactly where you are in the count. And the count is held by someone who does not lose track. The second thing to understand is the narrator. The book opens with Moses on Sinai and the angel of the presence speaking to him directly. This figure, the angel who stands nearest to the divine presence in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, is not invented for this book. It appears in Isaiah and elsewhere as the most intimate of heavenly intermediaries. The author's choice of this particular narrator is a deliberate claim, not merely that the information in the book comes from heaven, but that it comes from the innermost circle of heaven. You cannot revise what was said there without claiming an authority greater than the mountain itself. The third thing to understand is what scholars call rewritten Bible, and it shapes how you receive everything in the book. Rewritten Bible is a term for ancient Jewish texts that take existing scriptural material and retell it with expansions and interpretations woven so seamlessly into the narrative that the result reads as a single coherent story. The authors were not replacing the Torah. They were illuminating it, defending particular interpretations of it, drawing out the legal and theological implications that lay beneath the surface of the narrative, visible to those who knew how to look. The author of Jubilees is a master of this practice. When the book retells the creation story, it adds dates that connect Genesis to the legal code of Leviticus, suggesting that the two were never as separate as they appeared. When it retells the story of Noah, it expands the account of what went wrong before the flood, providing the context that Genesis deliberately left unexplained. When it retells the story of Abraham, it gives him a childhood, a moment of awakening, a specific gift of sacred language. Every addition serves the book's central concern. Every detail is there because the author believed it helped the community understand who they were and why it mattered. There is a man named David. He is 47 years old, and he has been a high school history teacher for 22 years. He picked up a scholarly edition of Jubilees a few years ago out of professional curiosity, and what caught his attention first was not any particular passage, but the dating system. He spent an evening working through the Jubilee calculations for the first 10 chapters and came away with the feeling he gets when he sees a well-designed piece of architecture. Someone spent a very long time thinking about how to build this. The structure is not accidental. There is a mind behind it. He is right. And part of what we are doing tonight is learning to see that mind at work. The Book of Jubilees moves in 4 broad movements, though the author does not name them. The first covers creation through the flood, the primordial history of the world, from its first moment through its near destruction and the renewal that followed. The second covers Abraham and the founding generation, the period when the covenant between God and a particular people was established in formal terms for the first time. The third covers Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, the carrying of the covenant through generations marked by failure and forgiveness and the complicated love that family stories always contain. The fourth covers the descent into Egypt and the long road towards Sinai, the crisis and the response, the moment when everything that was promised had to survive contact with the worst that history could produce. Each movement has its own weight. The first is vast and cosmological. The second is intimate and foundational. The third is conflicted and deeply human. The fourth is urgent, almost breathless, because the people reading it knew what was coming. They knew that after Sinai came the wilderness, and in their own time, the wilderness had already arrived. What the book offers across all four movements is this. The same God is present in the first creation day and in the last chapter before Sinai. The same commitment to covenant runs from Adam to Moses. The same sacred count measures every generation. And if you are a reader being told that your story does not matter, that your calendar is wrong, that your God is one option among many, then that consistency is not a literary feature. It is a declaration. You are not a footnote in someone else's story. You are the continuation of a story that began before the world existed. You are a line in the count, and the count is being held by the same hands that held the first morning. Those hands have not let go. That is the map. That is the shape of the forest. Now let us step inside. Chapter 3. In the beginning, again. Every tradition has a creation story. Every culture that has ever looked up at the sky and wondered where it came from has arrived at some account, some framework for understanding how the world began and what that beginning means for the people now living in it. The questions that creation stories answer are not scientific questions, though science has its own answers. They are the questions that persist underneath the scientific answers. Why is there something rather than nothing? What does it mean that the world exists? And what does the existence of the world suggest about the nature of the one, if there is one, who made it? The author of Jubilees has a creation story. And what makes it remarkable is not that it differs dramatically from Genesis. It covers the same 6 days, the same sequence of light and sky and land and stars and creatures and humanity, and the Sabbath rest on the 7th day. If you know Genesis, you will recognize every landmark. But recognition is not the same as understanding. And the places where the author's retelling quietly parts from the Genesis account are precisely where the deepest concerns of the book become visible. Let us go through the week slowly. The first day, God speaks light into existence. Most readers of Genesis know this well enough to recite it. But the author of Jubilees places something in the first day that Genesis does not mention. The angels. The author sets the angels at the beginning of everything, present in the first morning, before any creature breathed, before any seed fell, before the first light touched the first water, and their creation is described in a careful hierarchy. The angels of the presence who stand nearest to God, the angels of sanctification, the angels set over the various domains of the natural world, each with a specific station, each with a function that is theirs alone. In Genesis, the angels simply appear when they are needed, without any account of their origin. The author of Jubilees answers the question that Genesis leaves open, and in answering it, makes a claim that shapes everything that follows. The spiritual world, as the author constructs it, is not populated by arbitrary beings whose loyalties are unclear. It is ordered. It is structured the same way the calendar is structured, the same way the Jubilee system is structured. Everything has a place. Everything has a function. And at the summit of all of it, above every order of spiritual being, is the one who created them and whose purposes run through everything they do. For people living in a world that offered many competing spiritual frameworks, many gods and many spirits, all claiming authority, this was a significant thing to say. The spiritual world is not a democracy of competing forces. It is a creation with an architecture, and the architect is not one option among many. The second day brings the firmament. The third day brings dry land and the first green things. The author follows Genesis closely in both, but pays particular attention to the pattern of reproduction. The grasses and trees are not just created. They are given the capacity to continue themselves, seed bearing seed, each generation carrying the pattern of the one before it forward, into time. Creation is not a single event that happened once. It is a system designed to perpetuate itself across every season that follows. The fourth day is where the author makes the most significant departure from Genesis. And it is the departure that the entire book will spend 50 chapters defending. Genesis describes the fourth day briefly. The sun, moon, and stars are placed in the firmament to give light, to separate day from night, to serve as signs for seasons and days and years. This is the Genesis account. Suggestive, but brief. The author of Jubilees lingers here. In the retelling, the great lights are not simply sources of illumination. They are timekeepers, the instruments by which the sacred calendar is measured and maintained. And the calendar they mark, in the argument the author constructs, is a solar calendar of 364 days, divided into 4 seasons of 91 days each, 13 weeks per season, 52 weeks per year. A year that divides without remainder. A year in which every Sabbath falls on the same day of the month, every festival returns to the same point in the same week, and the sacred rhythm never drifts. The Hebrew word the author uses for seasons in this passage is moedim, the same word used throughout the Torah for the appointed times of the festivals, the sacred occasions when the community gathered to worship and remember. The author is embedding an argument in a single word. The sun and moon were not created to help you decide when to plant your crops. They were created to maintain the moedim, the appointed meetings between a people and their God. This is the theological heart of the creation account in Jubilees, and it is impossible to understand the rest of the book without it. The calendar is not a human invention, the author insists. It is not a political tool subject to revision by whoever holds power. It was written into the structure of creation on the fourth day, by the same God who spoke light into existence on the first. To abandon the appointed times, the author argues, is not a minor administrative adjustment. It is a departure from the order that was established before any human institution existed. For people living under a king who had replaced the sacred calendar with a Greek one, this was not an abstraction. It was the ground under their feet. The fifth day brings sea creatures and birds and the blessing of reproduction. The sixth day brings land, animals, and, finally, humanity. Here the author pauses, as Genesis pauses, because the creation of humanity is different from everything that came before. Every other created thing is spoken into existence. But humanity is created with deliberation, with a consultation that implies, even in the terse language of the text, that something more is happening here. Not just another creature being added to the list. A creature in whom the Creator is somehow reflected. The author does not elaborate extensively on the theology of the image of God, but the retelling does something subtler. It places the creation of humanity at the end of a fully prepared world. The light and sky and land and creatures and calendar were all in place before humanity arrived. The preparation preceded you. You were not an afterthought. The world was set before you like a table. The seventh day is the Sabbath. And this is where the author's argument arrives at its most important destination. The Hebrew word Shabbat does not primarily mean rest in the sense of stopping because you are tired. It carries the sense of completion, the deep satisfaction of having finished something and standing in the moment of its wholeness before the work of using it begins. The author is not describing a God who needed to recover from 6 days of creative effort. The author is describing a God who stood in the moment of completion and declared it holy, who separated the seventh day from all other days, not because nothing happened on it, but because what happened on it was different in kind. What happened on the seventh day was wholeness itself, and the decision to let that wholeness be enough. Shabbat, completion, not the end of something, the arrival of it. The author then makes the claim that gives the entire book its argumentative spine. The Sabbath, in this insistence, was not given first to Israel. The author argues that it was established in heaven before the world was made. The angels of the presence kept the Sabbath before there was an earth to rest on. And when the Sabbath was eventually given to Israel at Sinai, it was not the creation of something new. It was the extension of something ancient. the bringing of a heavenly practice down into the world of human time. If the Sabbath is a human institution, it can be replaced by other human institutions. But if it is a heavenly one, the author argues, written into the structure of creation before the first morning, then no human authority can revoke it. Not a Greek king, not a Roman emperor, not any council or edict that any power has ever issued or will ever issue. The Sabbath belongs to the order of creation, and the order of creation belongs to God. There is a woman named Elizabeth. She is 54 years old and she lives in a small town in Western Oregon. She is a nurse, which means she has worked more Saturdays and Sundays than she can count, and the concept of Sabbath has always felt, to her, like something designed for people with more ordinary schedules. She found her way to this section of the book late one night, after a 12-hour shift, through a reference in something she had been reading slowly for months. The phrase that stopped her was not the legal language. It was the idea that the seventh day is about completion. That rest is not recovery. That it is the experience of standing in the moment of something being finished and letting that be enough. She set down what she was reading. She sat in the quiet of the house where everyone else was already asleep, and for a few minutes she simply stopped. Not because anything was resolved, not because the week ahead was any less demanding, but because the word Shabbat had given her something she had not known she was missing. A name for the thing she had been trying to reach at the end of every long shift and never quite arriving at. Completion. Not performance. Not productivity. Not even rest, exactly. The experience of having been present, of having done what the day asked, of being finished for now, and letting that be enough. The creation week, as the author of Jubilees tells it, contains more than the physical world. It contains the structures that make it possible for all things to be in relationship with each other and with their Creator. The calendar, the Sabbath, the appointed times, the ordered hierarchy of beings, the dignity of humanity as the creature for whom everything was prepared in advance. It is a great deal to fit into 7 days. But then, in the count of Jubilees, the first week is not just 7 days. It is the first movement of a rhythm that will run for all of history. The first 7 beats of a song that is still being played. You can hear it if the room is quiet enough. The rhythm of the first week. The rhythm of completion. The rhythm of a world made not just to exist, but to be inhabited by creatures who could recognize it as gift. You are one of those creatures. And the gift is still being given. Chapter 4. The Garden and What Was Lost There. There is a story that almost everyone knows. A garden. A man and a woman. A tree they were told not to touch. A serpent with a different suggestion. A choice that changed everything. Most people who know this story think they know it completely. They heard it young, in a church or a classroom, or from a parent reading at bedtime, and the version they received has stayed with them in roughly the shape it arrived. The garden. The fruit. The fall. The exile. The author of Jubilees tells this story differently. Not in ways that contradict Genesis. In ways that slow down and look carefully at what Genesis passes over in a sentence. In ways that answer questions Genesis does not ask. And when you read the two versions alongside each other, something unexpected happens. The story does not become simpler. It becomes more honest, more specific, more recognizably human in the way that the best old stories always become more human when someone takes the time to look at what is actually there. The first addition the author makes to the Eden story is dates. Genesis does not tell you when Adam had entered the garden. It does not tell you how long he was there before Eve was created. It gives you the sequence of events without a temporal framework. The author of Jubilees gives you the dates. Adam was brought into the Garden of Eden on the 40th day after his creation. Eve was brought in on the 80th day. Why 40 and 80? A reader steeped in the Torah would recognize the connection immediately. The book of Leviticus, in its laws about purification after childbirth, specifies that after the birth of a male child, the period of purification is 40 days. After the birth of a female child, it is 80 days. The author is drawing a deliberate bridge between the creation narrative and the legal code, suggesting that the laws of Leviticus are not arbitrary human regulations. They are descriptions of a pattern written into the structure of creation itself. The law does not create order. The law describes an order that was already there. For a community being told that their laws were outdated and provincial, this was not a minor scholarly point. It was a foundation. The second edition is a name for the adversary. Genesis calls it simply the serpent and describes it as more crafty than any other wild creature God had made. Its origin is not explained. Its motivation is not examined. It speaks, it tempts, it is cursed, and then it largely disappears from the narrative. Genesis is not interested in developing the serpent as a character. It is interested in the choice made in response to what the serpent said. The author of Jubilees is more interested in where the adversarial presence comes from. In the retelling, the serpent is connected to a figure called Mastema, whose name comes from the Hebrew root meaning hostility or enmity. He is the adversary, the one whose function in the universe is prosecutorial. He tests. He opposes. He accuses. He is not identical to the Satan of later Christian tradition, though the family resemblance is clear. In the framework the author constructs, he is something more specific, a figure given a limited domain of operation within the created order. He can tempt and afflict, but only within boundaries that the Creator establishes and maintains. In placing the Eden temptation within the sphere of Mastema, the author is doing something pastorally important. What happened in the garden was not simply a story about human weakness and a forbidden fruit. In the author's telling, it was a move in a conflict that was already in motion before the man and woman were created. The garden was a theater of that conflict, and the human beings at its center were being watched by forces on both sides of a divide they could not fully see. This does not remove the responsibility of the human choice. The author is very clear that Adam and Eve made a real decision with real consequences. But it places that decision in a context that makes the stakes visible. And for people living under an empire that felt like an overwhelming force arrayed against them without reason, the acknowledgement that opposition was not God's design, but an intrusion into what God had made, was a meaningful thing to hear. The third edition is the most extensive. It is an account of what was actually lost. Genesis lists the consequences of the fall efficiently: pain, difficulty, conflict, exile, death, eventually. The narrative moves quickly from the fall to the expulsion, and then the story of history begins. The author of Jubilees slows down here, and what the retelling describes as lost is something that most readings of Genesis leave unnamed. Before the fall, in this telling, Adam and Eve knew no shame, not because they were ignorant of right and wrong, but because there was nothing in them that required concealment. They were fully known and fully at ease with being known. They did not need to manage how they appeared to God or to each other. They did not need to construct a version of themselves that was more acceptable than the version that actually existed. They simply were what they were, in the presence of the one who made them, and what they were was enough. After the fall, that transparency is gone, and its loss is not merely a moral consequence. It is an existential one. The experience of being known without concealment, of existing without the labor of self-presentation, of resting in the fact that the one who sees you completely is the one who made you completely and has not turned away. That is what the garden once contained. There is a man named Jonathan. He is 31 years old and he lives in Seattle, Washington. He works in a field that requires him to spend most of his working hours performing a version of himself that is optimized for the context he is in, choosing which thoughts to express and which to withhold, calibrating his communication for the audience and the platform and the relationship. He is very good at it. He has been doing it since he was a child, and it is largely unconscious at this point. He read the author's account of the garden late one night after a particularly exhausting week. The phrase that stopped him was not anything about serpents or sacred dates. It was the description of being known without concealment. He sat with that phrase for a long time, not because he thought it described something recoverable in his ordinary life, but because it named something he recognized as missing, something he had not had language for until that sentence gave him one. That is what the best old stories do. They give names to things you have been carrying without knowing what to call them. And everything that follows in the author's telling, every covenant, every Sabbath, every appointed time, every encounter between God and a human being that results in renewed relationship, can be understood as a move in the direction of what the garden once held. Not a replacement for paradise. A road that points toward it. The early chapters of the book, continuing after the expulsion from Eden, trace the generations from Adam to Noah with a precision that Genesis handles more briefly. Each generation is placed within the Jubilee count, and through all of these generations, the author traces a pattern that troubles the retelling at every turn. The pattern is forgetting. Not a single dramatic moment of rebellion. Not a day when someone decided to walk away. Something quieter and more honest than that. Imagine a fire built in a field on a cold night. While it is burning, everyone can see it. Everyone knows where the warmth is. But fires require tending. And if the people who built it become absorbed in other things, if the night grows busy with other demands, if one generation of tenders is replaced by the next, without careful instruction, then what was a fire becomes embers. And what were embers becomes ash. And by the time the next cold night arrives, no one can remember exactly where the fire was or how to build it back. That is what the author of Jubilees is describing. Not apostasy. Neglect. The slow cooling of what was once warmly known. The sacred calendar erodes. The appointed times drift. The Sabbath becomes harder to observe when the pressure of ordinary life pushes back against it. And no single generation wakes up one morning and decides to abandon the count. They simply attend to it a little less carefully than the generation before them did, and the generation after them attends to it a little less carefully still. Every community knows this drift. Every family knows it. Every individual who has ever tried to maintain a practice that required consistent effort against the pull of everything else knows what it feels like to look back and realize you are standing somewhere you did not choose to arrive. The garden is the image the author returns to for what that loss feels like. Not the dramatic exile, not the angel with the flaming sword, but the quieter, longer loss. The slow erosion of transparency, the gradual increase of distance, and the ancient hope carried in this book says, the distance is not the end, that the road back has been opened since the morning after the exile began, that every covenant and every Sabbath and every morning that arrives after a night that felt too long is a step in the direction of what was lost, not a return to innocence, something better than innocence, a return that knows what it was searching for. The road is open, and you are on it. Chapter 5. Enoch, the man who would not be forgotten. There are people in every tradition who seem to belong to a different category than the rest. Not saints exactly, though that word gets used. Not prophets exactly, though that word gets used too. Something harder to name. People whose relationship with the sacred seems less mediated than everyone else's, less dependent on the usual structures and institutions. People who seem to move through the ordinary world while simultaneously occupying some other register of existence that most of us only touch occasionally, in our quietest and most honest moments. Enoch is that kind of person in the Hebrew tradition. In Genesis, he appears in the middle of a genealogy. He is listed as the seventh generation from Adam, the son of Jared and the father of Methuselah. He lived 365 years, notably shorter than the vast lifespans of the other patriarchs listed around him. And then Genesis says something it does not say about anyone else in the list. It does not say that Enoch died. It says that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. 5 verses. one sentence that stands apart from all the others. And then the genealogy continues, moving on to Methuselah and Lamech and Noah, as though what just happened was unremarkable. But it was not unremarkable, and the tradition knew it. The phrase "walked with God" appears only twice in Genesis. Once for Enoch, once for Noah. It implies something more than obedience, more than moral rectitude, more than the ordinary faithfulness credited to other figures in the text. It implies a quality of intimacy, a sustained proximity to the divine, a life lived in such close alignment with the purposes of God that the usual distinctions between the sacred and the ordinary cease to operate in the usual way. And then God took him. That phrase generated centuries of reflection in Jewish literature because it opened a door that the text itself did not close. Where did he go? What was his status after the taking? Was he given a continuing role? Was he simply and finally at peace in a way that ordinary human life does not allow? The author of Jubilees has specific and purposeful answers. In the retelling, Enoch was the first human being to learn to write. Before Enoch, the knowledge accumulated by human beings existed only in memory, passed from person to person, generation to generation, through the fragile medium of speech and recollection. Enoch was the one who understood that knowledge needed a more durable form. He was the one who began to inscribe it, to give it a physical existence that could survive the death of the person who carried it, to make it possible for what one generation learned to be available to a generation that had not yet been born. The Hebrew word for this kind of writing and recording is related to zakar, to remember. To write something down is to give it a form that can be remembered beyond the capacity of any single human memory. In the ancient world, the person who could write was not a clerk. They were a custodian of what was worth keeping, a guardian of the community's memory against the erosion that time produces in everything it touches. Enoch, in the telling of this book, is entrusted with the memory of everything. The author places Enoch in the company of angels who taught him the movements of the sun and stars, the structure of the sacred calendar, the history of creation from its first moment, the significance of the Jubilee cycles. He received the comprehensive knowledge about the sacred order of things that the book of Jubilees itself is presenting. And he wrote it down. This is not a coincidence of content. It is deliberate architecture. The author of Jubilees is presenting Enoch as the original version of what the book itself is. A comprehensive record of the sacred order, received from heaven, preserved in writing, available to every generation that comes after, as a guide and a map and a remembrance of what the world was made to be. The Hebrew name Chanoch, which we render in English as Enoch, comes from a root meaning to dedicate or to initiate. To prepare something or someone for a specific purpose. Enoch is the dedicated one, set apart from ordinary human life and given over entirely to a particular function. His function is to be the keeper of the record. And then, in the author's telling, he was taken to the Garden of Eden. Not to a heavenly throne room, not to some abstract spiritual realm. To the garden, the same garden that was closed after the fall. The place of original transparency and intimate relationship, the location of what was lost when the first choice was made. The garden is still there, in the author's imagining of things. It is not destroyed. It is not emptied. And in the author's telling, it is inhabited by the one human being found faithful enough to return, who sits there still, writing down what he knows so that it will not be forgotten. Every generation that maintains the sacred memory, that keeps the calendar, that observes the Sabbath, that tells the old stories to the children, is participating in the work that Enoch began. Every act of preservation, every decision to carry the tradition forward rather than let it fall, is a continuation of his task. Someone is still writing. The record is still being kept. There is a woman named Ruth. She is 67 years old and she lives in Portland, Oregon. She spent her career as an archivist at a university library, which means she spent 40 years in rooms full of things that someone decided were worth keeping. Old letters, Unpublished manuscripts. Photographs of people whose names were written on the backs in fading pencil. Maps of places that no longer exist in the form they were mapped. She retired 3 years ago, and she still volunteers 1 day a week because, she says, she is not ready to stop being in rooms where the past is present. She found the author's account of Enoch through a colleague who mentioned it in passing, and she looked it up that evening. The image of Enoch in the garden, still writing, still preserving, still maintaining the record long after the world had moved on, was not strange to her at all. It was the most accurate description she had ever read of why the work she had done for 40 years mattered. Someone has to stay in the room with what is worth keeping. Enoch stayed. Now let us look at what the author of Jubilees understood Enoch to have known, because the content of his knowledge is as significant as the fact of his preservation. Enoch in this retelling is an astronomer in the ancient sense. Not someone calculating orbital mechanics, but someone who understands the movements of the heavenly bodies as a sacred language, the ongoing speech of the Creator made visible in the nightly sky. He understood the pattern of the solar year, the 364-day calendar, the 4 seasons of 13 weeks each. The great lights moving in their appointed paths without deviation, without error, without the need for human correction. And this knowledge was not for his own benefit. It was for transmission. He wrote it down so that after he was gone, the community would still have access to what the sky was saying, so that the calendar could be maintained not just by those who had received it directly from heaven, but by those who received it through the written record of someone who had. The Hebrew scriptural tradition has a word for this kind of transmission: Masorah, the thing passed from hand to hand. The Masoretic tradition of biblical copying is one of the great acts of sustained human faithfulness in the history of recorded knowledge, the letter-by-letter passing of a text from one generation of scribes to the next, preserving not just the words, but the precise form of the words, the spacing, the notations, the way the text is meant to be read and heard. Enoch, in the author's telling, is the origin of that instinct. The first person who understood that faithfulness to what has been received requires writing it down, not trusting memory alone, making the record, giving it to the future in the most durable form available so that the future can decide for itself whether the thing was worth keeping. The Book of Jubilees itself is an act of Masorah. The authors, writing under pressure in the 2nd century before Christ, chose to write down what they knew, to preserve it, to give it to every generation that came after in a form that could survive the destruction of the community that produced it. The community at Qumran that preserved 15 copies of this book in sealed jars was doing the same thing. The Ethiopian monks who copied it across 16 centuries were doing the same thing. And tonight, reading it, attending to it, letting it speak, you are somewhere in that line. You are among the people who decided that what Enoch began was worth continuing. That is not a small thing. Before we leave Enoch, there is one dimension of his story in the author's retelling that deserves careful attention. We are told that not all of the angels remained faithful. Some, in the period before the flood, descended from their proper place in the order of creation and made choices that disrupted the world in ways that would eventually require a drastic response. Enoch knew this was coming. He warned against it. He recorded it. And his faithfulness stands in deliberate contrast to the faithlessness of those who abandoned their station. The word for the proper place of an angelic being in ancient literature is often rendered as station or order. Every being, in the framework this author constructs, has a station, a specific function within the created order, a role that is theirs and that fits them the way a particular key fits a particular lock. When a being abandons its station, the order it was maintaining begins to fail. And the failure of one station creates vulnerability in everything adjacent to it. Enoch kept his station. He was given a function, and he fulfilled it. He wrote and preserved and witnessed and continued. And in keeping his station through a world that was losing its shape around him, he became the image of what faithfulness looks like when faithfulness is the only thing holding the line. there is a teacher named James. He is 43 years old, and he has taught middle school English in a school in rural Kentucky for 17 years. He is not famous. His students are not famous. But every year, without exception, he reads aloud to them from books he believes contain something worth preserving. Old books. Books no one on any bestseller list is currently recommending. He reads them because he believes that the act of giving them to the next generation through the physical act of his voice in a room is the thing he was made to do. It is his station. He has never heard of Enoch. He has never read the book of Jubilees. But he is doing what Enoch did. He is keeping the record. He is staying in the room. He is passing what he knows to the people who come after him in the only form that truly works. A person who cares about something, standing in front of other people, refusing to let it be forgotten. Enoch walked with God, and then God took him. And in the garden where the first transparency was lost, the author imagines him still there, writing, in the oldest and most faithful act of witness the tradition knows. Tonight, before you sleep, let that image rest somewhere in you. The record is still being kept. The thread is still in someone's hands. And you, right now, lying in the quiet of this particular night, are part of the count that has been running since the first morning. You are in the count. You have always been in the count. Sleep will come. And when it does, it will come to someone who has been seen and named and written down in the oldest record there is. You are held. Rest now. Chapter 6. The Watchers and the World That Drowned. There is a kind of failure that does not begin with bad intentions. It begins with good ones. It begins with a commission, a purpose, a genuine desire to help. It begins with someone moving toward another person, with the honest intention of being useful. And then, somewhere in the middle of that movement, something shifts. The original purpose quietly recedes. Something else moves into its place. And by the time the failure becomes visible, the distance between where the person started and where they ended up is so great that it is difficult to trace the exact moment when the drift began. The author of Jubilees tells a story about this kind of drift before the flood. And it is one of the most psychologically honest accounts of moral failure in all of ancient literature, precisely because it does not begin with wickedness. It begins with obedience that lost its way. Let us go back to where the story starts. In Genesis, the account of what happened before the flood is brief and strange. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they took wives from among them. Their children were the Nephilim, the mighty ones. And then, almost immediately, God looks at the earth and sees that human wickedness has become so great that the thoughts of every human heart are only evil continually. And then the flood. Genesis gives you the events without the explanation. The what without the why. And the why, as the author of Jubilees constructs the story, is one of the most important questions the text raises. The angels who would become the Watchers were not rebels from the beginning. The author places them in the world with a specific commission. The early human generations after Eden were struggling. The knowledge of the sacred calendar, the awareness of the created order and humanity's place within it was eroding. People were forgetting the Sabbath. They were losing track of the appointed times. They were drifting from the practices that connected them to the order written into creation. And in the author's retelling, God sent angels to help, to teach, to remind the human community of what had been given and was being lost. This is the origin of the Watchers in the author's telling. Not rebellion. Commission. They were doing their job, and then something changed. The shift is described not with the language of dramatic sin, but with the language of reorientation. The angels saw the daughters of men. They were beautiful, and the angels began to want something that was not theirs to want. Not because desire is inherently wrong, but because these were beings whose proper place was the order of heaven, whose function was defined by their relationship to the commission they had been given. and they began to reorient themselves around something outside that commission, something they had encountered in the process of doing their work, something that felt, in the moment, like a reasonable addition to what they were already doing. That is how drift works. It rarely presents itself as abandonment. It presents itself as addition. The children of the Watchers and the human women are called in the author's telling by two names: the giants, for their physical power, and the spirits that remained after the flood took the giants, for what they became in the world that followed. Because when the giants died in the flood, the author tells us, their spirits did not simply cease to exist. They remained disembodied, restless, still carrying the distorted desires of beings who had been made for one thing and had given themselves over to another. And these spirits, in the framework the author constructs, are the ongoing source of the pressure and corruption that press against human life in every generation after the flood. This is where Mastema reappears. When God commanded that these spirits be bound and removed from the human world, the author tells us that Mastema petitioned for a portion of them to remain. He argued that without them he could not perform his function in the created order. He could not test. He could not oppose. He could not carry out the work of adversarial examination that was, within limits, part of the structure of the world as it actually is. And in the author's telling, God agreed. 9/10 of the spirits were bound. 1/10 remained under Mastema's authority to continue their work among human beings. This passage is one of the most theologically charged in the entire book, and it is worth sitting with it carefully. In this ancient framework, the existence of ongoing adversarial pressure in the world is not a failure of divine power. It is a permitted and bounded operation within the divine order. The adversary has a prince. The prince has a function. The function has limits. And the limits are maintained by the same God who permitted the function in the first place. This does not make the pressure good. It does not minimize the suffering it causes in human life. It does not resolve every question about why a good God would permit any of this. But it refuses to allow the darkness to be understood as autonomous, as a power equal in scope to the Creator, as something operating entirely outside the awareness and governance of God. In the framework the author constructs, there is no suffering that has escaped the attention of the one who separated light from darkness on the first morning. That is cold comfort when you are in the middle of the darkness. The author knows this, but it is not nothing. And for people living under occupation, watching their children be drawn away from the practices that had defined their identity for generations, the affirmation that the darkness was bounded rather than sovereign was a foundation to stand on when the ground everywhere else felt unstable. Now let us come to Noah. Noah, in the author's retelling, is a more fully realized character than the Noah of Genesis. Genesis gives us a man who found favor in God's eyes, who was righteous in his generation, who built an ark and survived the flood and planted a vineyard afterward. The broad strokes are present, but the interiority is largely absent. We are given his obedience without his experience. What the author of Jubilees emphasizes about Noah is not primarily his moral character, though that is confirmed. It is his knowledge. Noah knew the calendar. Noah understood the sacred count. In a generation where the transmission of heavenly knowledge had been corrupted and the human world had lost its orientation to the sacred rhythms of creation, Noah was the one who had maintained what everyone else had abandoned. He knew when the Sabbath fell. He knew the appointed times. He knew how to count the weeks of years. This is a significant interpretive move. The flood, in the author's construction, is not just a story about the punishment of wickedness. It is a story about the catastrophic consequences of losing the sacred knowledge that holds a community in right relationship with the created order. The world that drowned was a world that had forgotten how to count. And the world that was preserved through a man who had refused to forget. After the flood, the author gives us a covenant scene richer and more detailed than the Genesis account. The rainbow covenant in Genesis is beautiful and brief, The author of Jubilees includes all of it, but adds a legal dimension that Genesis leaves implicit. The covenant made with Noah in this retelling includes obligations that apply not just to Israel but to all of humanity, to every descendant of Noah, which means every human being who has ever lived after the flood. The rainbow is the sign, and the author is careful to establish that the rainbow is not a meteorological phenomenon to which God has retrospectively assigned meaning. It is a deliberate inscription. God writes the covenant into the sky in light and water so that every human being who looks up after the rain will have access to the reminder, regardless of whether they know the book that contains the covenant's text. The sky itself is a page. The rainbow is a sentence. And the sentence says the same thing it has always said, in every century, in every language, over every landscape where rain has fallen and the sun has come back. I have not forgotten. The covenant holds. You are still here because I have not let go. There is a man named Samuel. He is 58 years old and he lives in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up without a sustained religious practice of any kind. 3 years ago, his youngest daughter was in a serious accident. She recovered fully, but the months of uncertainty changed something in him in a way he has never been entirely able to articulate. He found himself paying attention to things he had not paid attention to before. The quality of light at certain times of day. The fact that his daughter was alive and that her being alive was not something he had arranged by his own effort. He started reading. He found his way to the Noah story in this book through a reference in something else he had been reading. The covenant scene stopped him for a long time. Not the rainbow itself, which he had seen thousands of times without thinking about it, but the idea that the rainbow was a sentence written in the sky for everyone. That you did not have to know the book to receive what the sky was saying. That the covenant extended to all of Noah's descendants, which is all of us, which is everyone who has ever stood in a parking lot or a hospital garage or an open field and looked up after the rain and seen the colors spreading across the gray. He texted his daughter a photograph of a rainbow 2 weeks after he read that passage. She called him back and asked what it was for. He said he was not entirely sure, but it felt important to send. That is the covenant of Noah, older than any tradition, available to anyone who looks up. The flood recedes. The ark rests on the mountains. The animals come out, and Noah plants a vineyard. The final image of Noah in the author's retelling is not his drunkenness, which Genesis records and which has generated much commentary across the centuries. The final image is the planted vineyard itself. The act of planting. The commitment to a future you will not fully live to see. The decision to put something into the ground and trust that the ground will hold it, that the seasons will continue, that the harvest will come in its time, even though the planter cannot guarantee any of it. That is what it looks like to live on the other side of the flood. Not certainty, not the resolution of every question, but the planted vine, the seed in the ground, the choice to continue, one harvest at a time, trusting the covenant written in the sky. The world that drowned was a world that had forgotten what it was for. The world that began again was a world that remembered, imperfectly, with setbacks and failures and one regrettable evening in a tent, but it remembered. And the remembering was enough to keep going. It is enough for you too. Chapter 7. Abraham, the man who asked the right question. His name, at the beginning, was Abram, and he grew up in a city that worshipped things he could not make himself believe in. This is not how Genesis begins the story of Abraham. Genesis begins in the middle, with the call, with God speaking to Abram and telling him to leave his country and his kindred and go to a land that God will show him. Genesis is not interested in who Abram was before the call. It is interested in his response to the call. He left. That is the Genesis account of Abraham's beginning. The author of Jubilees is interested in who he was before. Abram was born in a city called Ur of the Chaldeans. His father Terah made idols. The city was full of them. The religion of Ur was a religion of objects, of carved stone and shaped wood and molded metal, of figures that represented divine personalities the people of Ur believed governed the world. This was not unusual. It was the religious landscape of the ancient Near East. Virtually every city had its gods, its temples, its system for maintaining the favor of the powers that controlled rain and harvest and war. Abram grew up inside all of that, and something in him could not accept it. The author gives us a scene that Genesis does not contain. A young Abram, alone at night, looking up at the sky, watching the stars, and thinking. The stars in the ancient world were not merely beautiful. They were considered divine agents, powers that governed the world from their positions in the heavenly vault. The astrology of the ancient Near East was a serious system of thought, widely believed, socially important. The framework through which educated people in Abram's world tried to understand the forces shaping human destiny. If you wanted to know what was going to happen, you looked at the sky. And Abram, watching the sky, had a thought that changed everything. If the stars govern the world, he reasoned, then what governs the stars? It sounds almost naive when you state it plainly, but in the religious world Abram inhabited, it was a question with a revolutionary answer, because the only answer that satisfied it was something greater than the stars, something that the stars themselves obeyed, something whose authority was not localized in any particular object or place or culture, but extended to the entire created order. This is what the author of Jubilees wants you to see about Abraham. He did not receive his faith as a sudden divine intervention descending on an otherwise ordinary man. He reasoned his way toward it, standing under the sky, watching the lights move in their appointed paths, refusing to stop at an answer that was too small for the question. The Hebrew word for this kind of careful working through is keshbon, calculation, reckoning, the act of thinking something out completely and arriving at the conclusion that the evidence demands. Abram did the cheshbon, and the cheshbon led him to God before God formally called him. There is a woman named Caroline. She is 34 years old and she lives in Austin, Texas. She was raised without religion in a household that was not hostile to faith, but simply indifferent to it. She studied biology in college, then environmental science in graduate school, and her professional life has been organized around the careful observation of systems, how things work together, how the smallest elements maintain relationships with the largest, how disruption in one part creates consequences in parts that seem entirely unconnected. She told a friend once that the longer she had studied living systems, the harder it became to believe that the complexity she was observing was accidental. Not because she had arrived at a specific theological conclusion, but because every system she examined had the quality of something designed, something that required an intelligence to comprehend it. And the intelligence required to comprehend it seemed to point quietly and persistently toward an intelligence that had created it. She does not know the story of Abram under the stars, but she has had his experience. She has stood in the middle of something too coherent to be random and asked the question his question implies: who made this? And she has not found a satisfying answer that does not begin with someone who knew what they were doing. That is Abram before God spoke to him, a person who had already arrived at the question, who was ready for the answer when it came. Now let us follow him into the answer. The call in the author's retelling follows the same broad shape as the call in Genesis. God speaks to Abram. He is told to leave. He is promised land and descendants and blessing. He goes. But the author adds a dimension to the call that Genesis leaves implicit. The call includes the restoration of the Hebrew language to Abram. In the framework the author constructs across the whole book, Hebrew was the original language of creation. Adam spoke it. The patriarchs before Babel spoke it. It was the language in which God and human beings communicated before the catastrophe of the tower. When Babel scattered humanity into many languages, Hebrew was lost to most of the world as a living tongue. It survived in hidden form, preserved in a few places, but it was no longer the universal language it had once been. When God called Abram, one of the first gifts given, in the author's telling, was the restoration of this language. An angel was sent to teach Abram to read and speak Hebrew again, and the author tells us that Abram mastered it in 6 months. Not because he was exceptionally gifted, but because it was not entirely foreign to him. It was the language of his deepest nature, the language his soul had been shaped to speak, the language of the God he had already been turning toward under the stars. The idea embedded here is quietly powerful. Your deepest nature is not formed by the culture you happen to be born into, however fully that culture shapes you. It is formed by a relationship that existed before your culture, before your city, before your language, before everything that is contingent and local about the circumstances of your birth. And when that original relationship is renewed, when the call comes and you respond, something in you recognizes the language you are being spoken to in, because it is the language you were made for. Most people who are honest about their inner life have had a version of this experience. A sentence in a book, a phrase heard unexpectedly, a moment of sudden clarity in an ordinary afternoon that felt less like new information and more like recognition. Like being addressed in a language you had somehow always known and had been waiting, without fully realizing it, to hear again. The author is describing that experience when the text says that Abram learned Hebrew in 6 months. It was not learning. It was remembering. The covenant God makes with Abraham in this retelling is more elaborate than the one in Genesis. Not different in substance, more carefully articulated. And the Hebrew word for covenant is worth pausing on before we go further. The word is berit. It does not mean contract in the sense of a transactional agreement between parties of equal standing. It means something closer to bond, a relationship established not primarily by mutual benefit, but by commitment, by the choice of one party to be bound to another in a way that persists regardless of changing circumstances, that cannot be dissolved by disappointment or failure or the passage of time. When God makes a berit with Abraham, it is not a business arrangement. It is a declaration of permanent attachment. I am yours. You are mine. And that is not contingent on your performance. It is prior to your performance. It is the ground on which your performance takes place. The sign of the covenant in this retelling is circumcision, as in Genesis. And the author is insistent that circumcision is not merely a ritual marker or a tribal identification. It is the covenant made flesh, a physical inscription of the permanent attachment in the body of every male member of the community. And the author connects it not just to Abraham, but to every generation that enters the covenant after him. Every generation enters through the same door, wears the same mark. This insistence has a context. The Maccabean crisis included specific edicts against circumcision. Mothers who circumcised their sons were executed, the children with them. This was a direct assault on the bodily sign of the berit. In that context, the argument the author constructs, that circumcision is the heaven-ordained, creation-rooted sign of the covenant, is not abstract theology. It is resistance. You can kill our bodies. You cannot break the covenant that the bodies carry. Now let us come to the moment in the Abraham story that the author handles with the most theological care, the binding of Isaac. In Genesis, God tells Abraham to take his son, his only son, the son he loves, and offer him as a burnt offering. Abraham goes. He binds Isaac. He raises the knife. And then the angel of the Lord stops him, and a ram is found in a nearby thicket, and Isaac lives. This is the Genesis account, and it has generated more theological reflection than almost any other passage in the Hebrew Bible. The question it raises is one of the most troubling a text can raise. Why would a good God ask for this? What does the asking reveal about the nature of God? How do we hold this story honestly? The author of Jubilees has an answer, and the answer reframes the entire scene. In this retelling, the binding of Isaac does not originate with God. It originates with Mastema. The adversarial figure approaches and proposes the test. He is not revealing a hidden weakness in Abraham. He is proposing a formal examination of the fidelity that Abraham has been claiming his whole life. And God, in the author's telling, agrees to the test. Not because God has any doubt about Abraham, but because the demonstration of Abraham's faithfulness under the most extreme possible pressure produces something that private assurance could not produce. It produces a witness, a record that cannot be argued with, because it did not happen behind closed doors. It happened on a mountaintop, with a knife raised and a fire laid and a sun bound, with everything that Abraham had been promised at risk of total destruction. And Abraham held. The ram in the thicket is provided. The son is returned. The voice from heaven stops the knife. And that voice, in the author's construction, is not the voice of God reversing an earlier command. It is the voice of God declaring that what Mastema proposed as a test of destruction has become, through Abraham's faithfulness, a demonstration of a relationship so deep and so durable that nothing, not even the fear of total loss, could break it. The Berit is not damaged by the test. The test reveals the depth of the roots. Every extreme pressure that the adversary can bring against the covenant only shows more clearly how far down those roots go. There is a father named Michael. He is 49 years old and he lives in Denver, Colorado. His oldest son was diagnosed with a serious illness when he was 7. The treatment was long and the outcome was uncertain for many months. Michael is not a formally religious man, but he found himself in the small hours of too many mornings, in conversations with whoever was listening that he could not quite call prayer and could not quite call anything else. Not bargaining. Not demanding. Something closer to the Abraham moment. The willingness to hold out what he loved most and say, I do not understand this. I cannot make it make sense. But I have not let go of you. His son recovered. Michael does not claim that his holding on caused the recovery. He does not make theological arguments about outcomes. But he says that the willingness to keep the conversation going during those months, to continue reaching toward whatever is ultimate, even he had nothing to bring to it but his fear and his love, changed something in him that has not changed back. He came out of it closer to the truth than he was going in. That is Abraham. That is the Berit. That is what it looks like when the test that was designed to break the covenant only deepens it. The author closes the account of Abraham not with the binding but with his death. He dies at 175 years of age, having seen 4 generations of his descendants, having watched the promises begin to take visible shape in the world. He calls Isaac and Jacob to him before he dies and gives them a final instruction. Walk in the ways of God. Observe the Sabbath. Keep the appointed times. Do not follow the nations in their calendars and their festivals. Hold to the count. Stay in the rhythm. Remember who you are. That is the last thing Abraham says in the telling of Jubilees. Not a summary of his theology. Not a list of his achievements. Just the most practical and most loving instruction a man can give to the people who will continue after him. Remember who you are. You are in the covenant. You are in the count. You are the descendants of the man who looked at the stars when he was a teenager in Ur and refused to accept an answer too small for the question the stars were asking. The stars are still there tonight. The question is still open, and the one the question points toward has not changed. Chapter 8. Jacob, Esau, and the Weight of Inheritance. There is a question that every generation has to answer for itself. Not out loud, usually. Not in a single moment of formal decision, but in the accumulation of small choices. In the things you keep and the things you let fall. In the practices you maintain when no one is watching, and the ones you quietly abandon when they become inconvenient. The question is simply this: what will you carry forward? The story of Jacob and Esau in the author's retelling is the story of 2 brothers who answered that question differently. And the way the author tells that story is more careful and more honest than most readers of Genesis would expect. It refuses to give you a simple villain and a simple hero. It refuses to let you walk away with the comfortable feeling that you have understood what happened without understanding why. Let us begin where the author begins this story. Not with the famous birthright scene, not with the stolen blessing, but earlier, with the pregnancy of Rebekah and the word she received before her sons were born. Genesis tells us that Rebekah inquired of the Lord when the children struggled within her and received the word that 2 nations were in her womb, 2 peoples that would be divided, the older serving the younger. The Genesis account is brief and decisive and sets up everything that follows. The author of Jubilees gives the prophecy to Rebekah in a more expanded form and places it in her mouth in a later scene where she speaks directly to Jacob before the events of the blessing. This is a significant narrative choice. In Genesis, the prophecy belongs to God and is recorded by the narrator. In this retelling, it belongs to Rebekah and is spoken to her son. The effect is to make Rebekah not just a witness to the divine plan, but an active participant in its transmission. She knows. She has always known, and the knowledge has shaped every decision she has made in relation to her 2 sons across decades of a complicated and demanding life. Rebekah, in this retelling, is not a scheming mother who favors one son for personal reasons. She is a woman carrying a revelation that was given to her before her sons drew their first breath, acting on what she was told in the most intimate communication she ever received. What it costs to carry knowledge like that through an ordinary life, alongside a husband who does not fully share it. Watching 2 sons grow in directions you can see more clearly than anyone else because you have been given a map that no one else has read. The author honors that cost without minimizing it. Now let us come to Esau. Because Esau is where the author does the most careful and the most important work. In popular readings of the Genesis narrative, Esau tends to be a somewhat sympathetic figure, earthy, physical, impulsive, a man who was wronged by his brother and his mother. The tears he sheds when he discovers that the blessing has been given to Jacob generate genuine sympathy in most readers. It is hard not to feel something for Esau in that moment. The author of Jubilees does not deny the grief, but the retelling reframes what Esau lost and what he had already done with it long before the stew and the goat skins. The birthright in this retelling carries something specific. It carries the covenant, the responsibility of maintaining the sacred calendar, the Sabbath, the appointed times, the knowledge that Abraham received from heaven and passed to Isaac, and that Isaac was responsible for passing to whichever son received the inheritance. Esau sold the birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil stew. Genesis records this. But the author is explicit about what Esau understood when he made that trade. He knew what he was selling. He was not simply impulsive in the moment. He was acting on a settled disposition toward the covenant and its obligations. He found the practices burdensome. He was oriented outward, toward the world of the nations, toward ways of life defined by different rhythms and different loyalties than the covenant required. The Hebrew word that appears in connection with Esau's choice is bazar, to despise, to treat as worthless, to assign a value so low to something that what follows from that valuation is not felt as loss. Esau did not sell the birthright because he was starving and desperate. He sold it because he had already decided, in the privacy of his own orientation, that it was not worth keeping. The stew was not the cause. It was the occasion for a decision that had already been made. This distinction changes the moral weight of everything that follows. When Jacob receives the blessing, he is not stealing something that rightfully belongs to his brother. He is receiving something his brother had already abandoned. The blessing cannot go to the one who despised the covenant, because the blessing is the covenant, and the covenant requires someone who values it enough to carry it. Jacob was not a perfect man. His methods in the blessing scene were deceptive, and the damage to his relationship with his father was real. The author does not minimize any of that, but the retelling insists that the covenant found the right home, not because Jacob was morally superior to Esau in every dimension, but because Jacob wanted what the covenant carried. He wanted it enough to pay for it with a bowl of stew, enough to risk his father's anger and his brother's fury to receive it formally. Wanting the covenant, in the framework of this ancient text, is not a small thing. It is the beginning of everything. The Hebrew name Yaakov, Jacob, comes from the root meaning heel, because he was born grasping his brother's heel. But the same root carries another meaning: to follow closely, to pursue, to stay on the path of something moving ahead of you and not let it get away. Jacob is the one who follows closely, the one who will not let the covenant outpace him. Now let us come to the encounter at the river Jabbok, the night when Jacob wrestled with the angel and received the name Israel. Genesis gives this story in one of its most compressed and mysterious passages. Jacob is alone by the river. A man wrestles with him until the break of dawn. The man cannot overpower him and touches the socket of his hip, putting it out of joint. Jacob holds on. The man asks to be released. Jacob refuses unless he receives a blessing. His name is asked. His name is given. And then he is told that his name will no longer be Jacob but Israel. The man leaves. Jacob names the place Peniel, the face of God, because he has seen God face to face and lived. The author of Jubilees frames this encounter as a covenant renewal. Jacob is crossing back into the land of promise after 20 years in Haran, 20 years away from the land where the covenant was rooted. He is returning to face Esau, who may still want to kill him. He is returning to the land of his fathers. He is returning to the covenant. And on the night before he crosses, the covenant comes to meet him. The wrestling, in the author's construction, is not an attack. It is an initiation. It is the covenant pressing itself into the body of the man who carries it, marking him with the wound that will make him limp for the rest of his life, changing his name to reflect what he has become. The Hebrew name Yisrael, Israel, contains the root Sarah, to strive or to wrestle, and the divine name El. Israel means the one who strives with God, or perhaps more accurately, the one who persists with God, who does not let go, who holds on through the long night until the blessing comes. And the blessing comes not because the holding on was without cost. It comes because of the cost. The limp and the name arrive together. You cannot have one without the other. This is one of the most important things the author of Jubilees has to say. And it says it not in a sermon, but in the body of a man walking away from a riverbank at dawn, favoring one leg, carrying a new name. Faithfulness to the covenant is not painless. It does not leave you unchanged. It marks you. It reshapes you in ways that are visible, that you carry in your gait and your posture and the way you move through the world for the rest of your life. Jacob limped for the rest of his life. And the limp was not a punishment. It was a testimony. There is a woman named Helen. She is 51 years old and she lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She is the third of 4 children, and she is the one who took care of her aging parents in the last years of their lives, who maintained the family traditions, who made sure the holidays were observed and the stories were told and the photographs were labeled with names and dates before the people who knew the names and dates were gone. Her siblings are not absent or malicious. They are busy. They are scattered. But Helen is the one who wanted the thread and picked it up and did not put it down. She is not always appreciated for this. She is sometimes resented for it. But she continues. Because she has decided, in the same way Jacob decided, that the thing is worth carrying, even when the carrying is not easy or recognized. Jacob is Helen, and Helen is Jacob. And in every family and every community and every tradition there is someone who grasped the heel and would not let go. The Jacob story does not end at the river. It ends with Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. This is one of the facts that everyone who knows these stories knows. The author of Jubilees does not soften it. The brothers saw Joseph coming across the field. They conspired. They stripped him of the coat that marked him as his father's favorite. They threw him into a pit. And when the traders came, they sold him. A boy exchanged for the price of a minor transaction. And then they dipped the coat in goat blood and brought it to their father. The grief of Jacob at the loss of Joseph in the author's retelling is extended and emotionally honest. He tears his garments. He refuses to be comforted. He descends into a mourning that has no bottom, because the loss of Joseph is not just the loss of a child. It is a crisis of covenant continuity. The covenant that runs from Abraham through Isaac through Jacob is supposed to reach the next generation through all 12 sons. Losing Joseph is losing part of the structure. And yet the author tells the story with the calm of a narrator who knows what the reader does not yet know. That Joseph will survive. That the cruelty of the brothers will become, through a sequence of events that no human being could have designed, the mechanism by which the entire family is preserved from famine. That the pit was not the end of the story. It was the passage to a part of the story that nobody in it could have written. The Hebrew word for this kind of movement is Yeshua, salvation, deliverance. The word carries the image of being pulled from a narrow place, of breath returning to a body that was running out of it, of standing on solid ground after the water had been overhead. To be saved, in the root meaning of this word, is to be brought through the thing that seemed like the end and set down on the other side of it, still breathing, still holding, still in the count. Yeshua, the word that names what happened to Joseph in the pit, the word that names what the whole story, from creation to Sinai, is finally about. The covenant was brought through, carried in the bodies of 12 sons who would become 12 tribes, who would spend 400 years in Egypt becoming a nation, who would come out of that formation under Moses and receive at Sinai the full articulation of everything that had been preserved through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and all the unnamed faithful ones who kept the count through. The long years of waiting. What will you carry forward? Jacob carried the limp and the name. He carried the grief of a father who lost a son and did not know for decades that the son was alive. He carried the covenant through all of it, imperfectly, with the marks of every night he had wrestled visible in the way he moved. And when the count was finally complete, when all 12 sons were gathered and the family was whole, and the old man could see, in the last years of his life, that the covenant had not broken, that it had bent under every pressure and held, he blessed his sons, all 12 of them, by name. And the count continued. Chapter 9. Moses, Sinai, and the reason the book was written. Every book has a reason it was written, not the reason stated inside the book. The deeper reason, the urgency that made writing necessary, the sense that the moment demanded a permanent form for something that was in danger of being lost forever. We have arrived, in following this ancient text, from creation through the patriarchs to the edge of Sinai, at the place where we can finally see the book from the outside, where we can understand not just what it says, but why it was written at all. Why the author or authors who produced it felt that this particular book, in this particular form, at this particular moment in history, was not optional. And the answer transforms the Book of Jubilees from an ancient curiosity into something that speaks directly to the experience of anyone who has ever tried to maintain something sacred in the middle of a world that is actively working to make that maintenance feel impossible. Let us go back to the world in which this book was born. The 2nd century before Christ was, for the Jewish people, a period of existential pressure. Not the first such period, and not the last, but one of the most acute. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV had implemented a program of forced Hellenization that targeted Jewish religious practice at its core. The Torah was prohibited. Sabbath observance was a capital offense. The temple was rededicated to Zeus. Circumcision was outlawed. People were being killed for the practices that had defined their identity for generations. And the calendar was replaced. This detail is the one that speaks most directly to the heart of the Book of Jubilees. The sacred calendar, the system of appointed times that the author insists was established by God on the 4th day of creation, inscribed in the movements of the sun and maintained by every faithful generation from Adam to the present, was being overwritten by the Greek calendar. The count was being erased. For the community that produced this book, this was not a political inconvenience. It was an attempt to remove them from their place in the sacred order of creation, an attempt to make them strangers to the rhythm that had defined their identity since before the world was made. And they responded by writing, "What the Book of Jubilees does, understood in this context, is remarkable in its scope and its strategy. It does not write a polemic against Antiochus. It does not produce a political manifesto. It goes much further back, all the way to the beginning, all the way to the first day. It says, in the form of a narrative spanning all of history from creation to Sinai, the calendar you are being told to abandon was not invented by your ancestors. The author insists it was established by God before the world was made. It was practiced by the angels in heaven before there was an earth to practice it on. It was received by Adam, carried by Noah, lived by Abraham, transmitted through Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And it is about to be formally articulated at Sinai, in the encounter that the entire story has been building toward. You are not being asked to give up a tradition. You are being asked to give up your place in the created order. The answer to that demand is no. And the Book of Jubilees is that no, written in the most comprehensive and most grounded form available to its authors. This is why the framing device of the angel of the presence dictating to Moses matters so much. The author is not saying, "Here is my opinion." The author is saying, "Here is what was revealed on the mountain," not in living memory, not in the tradition of a particular school or city. On the mountain, in the encounter where the Torah was given, by the mediator who stands closest to the divine presence. You cannot revise this without claiming an authority greater than Sinai. And no empire has that authority. The argument is made not through logical proposition, but through narrative, through 50 chapters of story that roots the calendar and the Sabbath and the covenant so deep in the structure of creation, so thoroughly in the bodies and histories of the patriarchs who preceded the reader, that pulling them out would require pulling out everything else as well. The community at Qumran, which preserved 15 copies of this book in desert caves, was itself organized around a similar conviction. They had separated from the Jerusalem establishment in part over a dispute about the calendar. They believed, on the basis of texts like Jubilees, that the official Jerusalem calendar was wrong, and that a community serious about its faithfulness had to maintain the correct count, even if it meant separation from the broader community. They were doing in their own time exactly what the Book of Jubilees was calling the community to do. Holding the count, maintaining the rhythm, refusing to let the pressure of the surrounding culture determine when they worshipped. Now, let us look at Moses as the author presents him. Moses is the one who sits with the angel of the presence and receives the full history of creation and the patriarchs. He has Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in his ancestry. He has the stories. He has the traditions. But here on the mountain, with 40 days and 40 nights before him, he receives the whole structure at once. The full pattern, the complete shape of everything that the covenant has been carrying through the generations. The Hebrew name Moshe, Moses, is traditionally understood to mean drawn out, from the root masha, because he was drawn out of the water by Pharaoh's daughter. But masha carries another direction as well, the drawing out of something that was submerged, the bringing to light of what lay beneath the surface, the making visible of what was hidden in plain sight all along. Moses is not primarily a lawgiver in the author's construction. He is a scribe. He is the Enoch of his generation, the one entrusted with writing down what is in danger of being lost. And his 40 days on the mountain are not 40 days of receiving new information. They are 40 days of being shown the full pattern that was always there. The whole structure of which the law he is about to carry down the mountain is the latest and most complete expression. The laws of Sinai, in the author's argument, are not God legislating for the first time. They are God formalizing for Israel what was written into creation before the first morning, practiced by the angels before the world existed, observed by the patriarchs before it was commanded. now articulated in full so that no generation after this one has the excuse of not knowing. Masha, drawn out into the light, not invented, revealed. The weight of this does not crush in the telling of Jubilees. It grounds. You know what you are carrying. You know where it comes from. You know how long it has been in the world and how many generations before you have held it. You are not the first. You will not be the last. And the thing you are holding is not a burden placed on you arbitrarily. It is the thread of the count, the line that runs from the first day of creation to the day you are living in, passing through every covenant and every patriarch and every generation that refused to let it break. There is a student named Elena. She is 26 years old, and she is in the first year of a doctoral program in religious studies at a university in Boston, Massachusetts. She grew up in a household that was culturally Jewish but not observant, and she came to her academic work through genuine intellectual curiosity rather than through faith. She is not sure, most days, what she believes about God, but she is deeply sure about what she finds compelling in ancient texts. And what she finds most compelling in Jubilees is precisely this: the audacity of it, the scope, the willingness of a community under existential pressure to respond not by narrowing, not by retreating into a defensive minimalism, but by expanding, by going all the way back to creation and saying, everything you are trying to erase is older than you. Everything you are trying to replace was here before you arrived and will be here after you are gone. She said to a friend once that reading Jubilees in the context of its historical moment felt like watching someone stand up in the middle of a very loud room and speak quietly but with absolute clarity, not matching the volume of the disruption, not performing strength, just speaking from the ground, from the oldest ground available, with the calm of someone who knows exactly where they are standing and is not going to be moved. She is right. That is what Jubilees does. It finds the ground, and then it stands on it. We are approaching the end of the book now. The narrative ends not with the giving of the law, which takes place in Exodus, but with the community of Israel at the base of Sinai, having been brought out of Egypt, having survived the wilderness so far, standing at the bottom of the mountain from which Moses is receiving the revelation that has become the book we have been reading tonight. The circle closes at Sinai. The history that the angel of the presence has been narrating was always leading here. Creation led to the patriarchs. The patriarchs led to Egypt. Egypt led to the Exodus. The Exodus led to the wilderness. And the wilderness led to the mountain where the whole pattern is laid out in full, given permanent form, committed to the care of every generation that would come after. You are in that care. You are in that count. And the one who established it before the world was made has not lost track of where you are in it. Chapter 10. The Book That Would Not Die. There is a particular kind of survival that has nothing to do with strength. Not the survival of the powerful, who endure because they have the resources to resist what comes against them. Not the survival of the famous, whose names are maintained because enough people decided they were important, but the quieter, stranger survival of something that should have been lost by every reasonable measure. That passed through centuries of neglect and opposition and simple historical indifference and came out the other side, still intact, still readable, still capable of saying what it was trying to say to someone sitting in a quiet room a very long time after it was written. The Book of Jubilees is that kind of survivor. And the path it took through the centuries, from the moment it was written to the moment it became available to the world in the form we have been reading tonight, is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of preserved knowledge. It is not a story about powerful institutions protecting a treasure. It is a story about ordinary faithfulness, about people in every generation who looked at something worth keeping and decided, without fanfare and without certainty about the outcome, that they were going to keep it. Let us follow that path. The Book of Jubilees was written in the 2nd century before Christ, almost certainly in Hebrew, almost certainly in the land of Israel, by a community living under the pressure we have been discussing throughout this night. We do not know the author's name. We do not know precisely where or by how many hands the book was written. Some scholars believe it was the work of a single author with a unified vision. Others believe it shows signs of composition in stages, multiple voices contributing to a single sustained argument over time. The scholarly conversation on this question is ongoing. What we know is that the book exists and that it is more coherent and more carefully constructed than most texts of its age and genre. What we also know is that within a relatively short period of its composition, the book had reached the community that settled at Qumran, near the Dead Sea, in the desert of Judea. This community had separated from the Jerusalem establishment and organized their life around a strict interpretation of the Torah and the sacred calendar. They were, in the most literal sense, people who had gone to the wilderness to hold the count, and they brought Jubilees with them. When the Roman army moved toward Jerusalem in the 1st century of the Common Era, the Qumran community apparently knew that their settlement was in danger. They gathered their scrolls, placed them in clay jars, sealed against the desert air, and hid them in the caves above their settlement. They did not come back to retrieve them. Perhaps they could not. Perhaps the destruction that swept through the region in the year 70 reached them before they had the chance. The jars remained sealed in those caves for nearly 2,000 years. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy named Muhammad Ed-Dib was searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave opening and heard the sound of breaking pottery. He did not know what he had found. He had broken open what would become the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. The first of 11 caves containing thousands of manuscript fragments, including pieces of nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible and dozens of texts that had not been seen for 2,000 years. Among the fragments recovered from those caves were pieces of at least 15 separate manuscripts of Jubilees. 15 copies. In one community, preserved in clay jars in a desert for nearly 2,000 years, recovered by a thrown stone and a lost goat. 15 copies. More than some books that eventually entered the standard biblical canon. The community that sealed its library in those jars considered Jubilees among the most important texts it possessed. Not a supplement. Not an appendix. Essential. But the Qumran path ended in those sealed caves. The path that kept Jubilees alive and continuously readable across the full span of the centuries ran through a different community entirely. It ran through Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, with roots reaching back to the 4th century. The Ethiopian Church developed its own rich liturgical language in Ge'ez, its own deep tradition of biblical scholarship, and its own canonical list of sacred texts. That list, which is larger than the canons used by most Western Christian traditions, includes the Book of Jubilees, not as a supplement, not as a scholarly resource, as scripture. This means that Ethiopian monks were copying Jubilees in Ge'ez in the 5th century of the Common Era. In the 6th, in the 7th, when the rise of Islam was reshaping the religious landscape of the entire region, in the 8th century, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, the 16th, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th centuries, through every political upheaval and every challenge that the Ethiopian Church faced across 1,600 years of continuous existence. They copied it because it was scripture, because it was what you did with scripture, because the community before you had given it to you and the community after you was going to need it. Some truths persist, not because history is gentle, but because faithful people keep carrying them. There is a monk named Tekle. He is 63 years old and he lives in a monastery in the highlands of Ethiopia, where the mornings are cold and the eucalyptus trees outside his window are loud with birds at dawn. He has been a monk for 40 years. He has spent those 40 years in a rhythm of prayer and work and study that has not changed substantially since the monastery was founded several centuries before he was born. He chante in Gay, a language no longer spoken conversationally by anyone, maintained in the liturgy of the Ethiopian church with the same care that the Hebrew scribal tradition maintained the Torah. He knows passages of Jubilees by heart, not because he has studied it academically, because he has prayed it, chanted it, heard it read in the context of worship across 40 years of a life organized around encounter with the sacred. He does not think of himself as a preserver of a rare ancient text. He thinks of himself as a monk doing what monks do. But the text is preserved, in part, because of people exactly like him. People who did not decide to preserve it because it was important, who preserved it because it was what you did in the life they had given themselves to. And in doing what you do in the life you have given yourself to, without heroism and without announcement, you become the person through whom something that needed to survive actually survives. In the year 1870, an Ethiopian manuscript of Jubilees was acquired by scholars in the West and translated for the first time into a European language. For most Western scholars, this was the first time they had been able to read the complete text of Jubilees since late antiquity. The book had been known by name, referenced in early Christian and Jewish sources, occasionally quoted in fragments. But the complete book had not been available in a language accessible to Western scholarship for over 1,000 years. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and the Hebrew fragments from Qumran confirmed what the Ethiopian tradition had maintained for 16 centuries. The Ethiopic text was a faithful translation of an ancient Hebrew original. The monks had been copying accurately. The tradition had held. The book that had been hidden in desert caves and preserved in highland monasteries was the same book, the same words, the same count, the same insistence on the calendar and the covenant and the sacred rhythm of creation. Two transmission paths, one through desert caves and one through the highlands of Ethiopia, had independently preserved the same text across 2,000 years. The redundancy was accidental. The survival was not. Now let us ask the question that this history raises. Why does any of this matter? Not in the academic sense, though it matters there as well, but in the sense we have been exploring all night, in the sense of what the Book of Jubilees, after everything we have traced together from creation to the patriarchs, to Sinai, to the caves above the Dead Sea, to the highland monasteries of Ethiopia, to a German translation, to a Bedouin shepherd boy and a thrown stone, and the scholarly work of 8 decades since, has to offer to a person lying in a quiet room in the 21st century. Here is what I think it offers, and I want to say it plainly, because the plain version is the truest one. The Book of Jubilees was written by people who were being told that what they were was not good enough, that the rhythms they lived by were outdated, that the calendar they kept was wrong, that the God they worshipped was one option among many, and not a very sophisticated option at that, that the world had moved on, and they should move with it, or be left behind. And their response was to go all the way back to the beginning, to trace the thread from the first day of creation to the moment they were living in and show, as carefully and as completely as they could, that the thread was unbroken, that the sacred rhythm was continuous, that the ground they were standing on was older than the empire that was trying to move them off it, that it would be there after the empire was gone. That response did not save them from suffering. The crisis was real. The suffering was real. People died. But the book survived. And the book surviving is itself a testimony. Some truths persist not because history is gentle, but because faithful people keep carrying them. The text, hidden in desert jars, was recovered by a thrown stone. The translation, maintained in highland monasteries, in a language nobody speaks conversationally, was the key that unlocked the meaning of those desert fragments. The footnote in the academic article was the thread that led Clara in Nashville to 3 hours of reading and a feeling she recognized as recognition. The sacred rhythm held. Through everything that tried to break it, the sacred rhythm held. That is what this book tells you about the nature of what is sacred. Not that it is invulnerable, not that it cannot be threatened or suppressed or temporarily lost, but that it has a quality of persistence that is not proportional to the power of the institutions that support it. That it survives in clay jars and monastery libraries, and the memories of monks chanting at dawn, and the hands of ordinary people who decided, without knowing exactly why, that the thing was worth keeping. You are one of those people, and the substance of what all those containers were carrying is here now, in this room, in this night. The argument, the sacred rhythm, the insistence that you are part of a world that was made with intention by a God who has not forgotten the count, and that nothing that has happened to you or to the world since the beginning has broken the thread. You are still in it. The thread runs through you, as surely as it ran through Abraham under the stars, and Jacob at the river, and Joseph in the pit, and Moses on the mountain. The same count, the same covenant. The same patient and indestructible care that has been finding ways to reach human beings through desert caves and highland monasteries and footnotes in academic articles and quiet nights when someone who could not sleep followed a thread into something old enough to hold the weight of everything they were carrying. That is the legacy of the Book of Jubilees. Not a calendar system, not an alternative canon, not a scholarly puzzle to be solved. A testimony. We were here. We held the sacred rhythm through everything that tried to make us forget it. And we are giving it to you because you are going to need it too. Here it is.
Somewhere outside your window right now, the night is moving through its appointed hours. The same hours it has moved through since the fourth day of creation, when the great lights were set in the firmament to mark the seasons and the days and the years. The darkness outside is not empty. It is full of the accumulated weight of every night that has preceded this one. Every night in which a human being lay awake in a quiet room and reached for something that could hold the weight of what they were carrying. You have been awake for a while now. And in that time, you have traveled a considerable distance. From the first day, when light was spoken into existence and the structure of heaven and earth began to take shape, to the garden where the original transparency was lost and the long road back began, to the world before the flood and the man who refused to forget the count when everyone around him had, to the city of Ur, and a teenager watching the stars and refusing to stop at an answer too small for the question, to the river Jabbok, and the man who held on through the long night and walked away limping and named, to the pit and the boy sold by his brothers who became the instrument of their salvation, to the mountain and the scribe who received the full pattern and wrote it down so that every generation coming after would have access to it, to the desert caves and the clay jars and the thrown stone, to the highland monasteries and the monks chanting at dawn in a language nobody speaks conversationally anymore, doing what monks do, preserving without announcement what needed to be preserved, to the footnote in the academic article and the 3 hours of reading that followed it, and the 45-minute phone call between a grandson in Ohio and his grandmother in Addis Ababa, who had known this book her whole life without ever thinking of it as rare. To this room, to this night, to you. The Book of Jubilees is not a comfortable book. It makes demands. It insists on things. It is the product of a particular community in a particular crisis, and it carries the marks of that particularity. Some of what it claims is contested by scholars. Some of what it argues is specific to its own historical moment. And some of what it says about the nature of time and the sacred order of creation has been debated by communities of faith for 2,000 years without arriving at simple resolution. You do not have to resolve any of that tonight. You only have to breathe. The ancient hope that this book has been carrying for 2,000 years whispers it still. You are loved with a love older than the first morning. That is not a claim the Book of Jubilees makes about itself. It is what the book, in all its ancient particularity, is pointing toward. The way a finger points toward the moon without being the moon. The way a road points toward a destination without being the destination. The book is the road. And the road has been traveled by more people than you can count, in more centuries than any single tradition can claim, arriving at the same recognition by different routes. The sacred rhythm is real. The thread runs through you, and the one who holds it has not forgotten where you are in it. Think for a moment about everyone who traveled with you through this night. Clara in Nashville, who followed a footnote into 3 hours of reading and found in an ancient community the recognition she had been looking for without knowing what to call it. Marcus in Ohio, who texted his grandmother and listened for 45 minutes and understood for the first time that the distance between a footnote and a living tradition can be measured in one phone call. David in Kentucky, who saw the architecture before he saw the content and recognized, in the careful construction of the Jubilee count, the presence of a mind that had spent a very long time thinking about how to build something that would hold. Elizabeth in Oregon, who sat in a quiet house after a 12-hour shift and learned the difference between rest as recovery and rest as completion. Who understood, for the first time, what Shabbat was actually describing. Jonathan in Seattle, who found in a 2,000-year-old retelling of Eden a name for something he had been carrying without language for it. Who did not know, until that sentence gave him one, what to call the thing he was missing. Ruth in Portland, who spent 40 years in rooms with things worth keeping and knew immediately, when she read about Enoch in the garden, exactly what it meant to be the person who stays. Samuel in Chicago, who sent his daughter a photograph of a rainbow and did not entirely know why but felt, in some part of himself that did not require explanation, that it was important to send. Caroline in Austin, who stood in the middle of living systems too coherent to be accidental, and arrived, by the same route Abram arrived, at the question that points toward its own answer. Who made it to God through the door of biology and did not find the door strange? Michael in Denver, who held on through the long months and came out of it carrying something he could not have acquired any other way. Who came out of it closer to the truth than he was going in. Helen in Minneapolis, who grasped the heel and would not let go. Who has been carrying the thread through her ordinary life for years without anyone handing her an award for it. Who keeps carrying it because she decided, the same way Jacob decided, that the thing is worth the cost. Elena in Boston, who watched a community under pressure respond not by narrowing but by going all the way back to the beginning, and recognized in that response the only kind of courage she wanted to have. Tekli in the highlands of Ethiopia, who rises before dawn and chants in a language nobody speaks conversationally anymore, because the community before him gave him the words, and the community after him is going to need them. Who does not think of himself as a preserver of anything rare. Who is simply a monk doing what monks do. And who is, in the doing of it, one of the great faithful ones of his generation. Their stories are versions of yours. The same search, running in different rooms with different materials, arriving at the same recognition. The sacred rhythm is real. The thread runs through you. And the one who established the count before the world was made has not lost track of where you are in it. You are in the first jubilee of your life, or you are in the middle of it, or you are closer to the end than to the beginning. And from where you are standing, it may be difficult to see the full shape of the whole. But the shape is there. The sacred rhythm is running. Every Sabbath that has ever been kept, every appointed time observed, every morning that has arrived after a night that felt too long, every breath drawn by a human being, reaching for something true to hold on to in the middle of a world that makes holding on hard. All of it is in the count. All of it matters. None of it has been lost. Breathe in, slowly. Feel the weight of the day lift from the place where you have been carrying it. You have been carrying it faithfully. You do not need to carry it into the night. Breathe out. Let the sacred rhythm continue without your supervision. It has been doing so since before the first morning. It does not need your management to maintain its cadence. The night is moving through its appointed hours. The darkness outside is doing what darkness does, which is to make room for the light that is already on its way. The morning will come. It always comes. In the rhythm that was established before anything else was established. In the cadence that the ancient text we have been reading tonight traces all the way back to its source. You are in that rhythm. You have been in it the whole time. You are in the count. You are held by a care that existed before the world was named. You are known by the one who made you and has not turned away. And the morning that is coming toward you right now, across the dark and quiet hours of this particular night, will arrive at its appointed time, as it always has, as it always will. Sleep now. The sacred rhythm continues, and you are in it.